Studio marble basing or Minas Tirith / Osgiliath basing tutorial. We're going to be using a 25mm base for this because of, as I mentioned, the focus of this being the Lord of the Rings Games Workshop game. 25mm base for most of the warriors and such that will be used within that. And as you can see here, we've got a number of tile pieces that we're potentially going to use to build this. This is one of the molds. This comes from Green Stuff World. I think you can get a few other different versions from different suppliers, but that's the one we're using with some of the resin that they sell. Here are different sort of breakdown of the parts, some of the larger squares, some of the smaller components, bricks, different shaped tile pieces, so we can make some quite interesting looking bases. So what I've done here is I've selected a few of the tile pieces that we're going to use, and I've already started that process. As you can see, I've got a couple of the thinner pieces that look like plain bricks, a couple of the wider square pieces. You can see there's some overlap over the edge of the base. We'll deal with that as we come. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to just sort of fill some of these gaps with other parts of the pieces that you saw at the start of the video, and we're just going to sort of build it up from there. Now, ultimately the aim of this, and you can see some of these pieces I've sort of pre-broken. I've broken them up into smaller pieces, or they've broken as I've been trying to use them. And one of the things I've done with this resin mix is actually make it a little bit on the brittle side, so that we can apply some damage, as you may have seen from the title card, to make it look a little bit more like, you know, kind of a war-torn, worn down sort of piece of scenery terrain over time. So I've broken some of these pieces. I'm just going to fill in some of these gaps here, push it down quite firm, but I've made it quite brittle. If you push it down too firm, you will apply some of that battle damage rather unintentionally at this point. But we're just going to build it up, a little bit of super glue, just to try and, apologies for the blur as that comes into shot. But this is just going to be where we sort of build up. You can do this however you want. I've done this in a fairly logical way that I feel fits with what I'm trying to achieve. Once we start to break pieces off this, it'll start to look a lot more sort of interesting and kind of irrelevant in terms of how you actually set these pieces up. So you can do it however you want, really. There might be an additional series on some of the more interesting pieces that you might be able to do with some of the, you know, sort of slightly different tile pieces that we have. As you saw, there's a few different versions that we can use, and there's all sorts of molds and such out there if you want to do that. Of course, you can use Green Stuff molds, or you can have the rolling pin type molds for a little bit more of a speedy approach. This sort of base I'm probably not going to do for the whole force. I'll probably just use for characters such as Aragorn, Gandalf, and Boromir and such, but we'll sort of see how that goes. And of course, this process can be applied to any gaming system that you want. It doesn't have to be for Lord of the Rings. You can obviously use it for whatever. Make interesting bases, even make pieces of terrain and scenery if that's the way you want to go with this. But I'm just going to keep adding pieces to this, fill in these little gaps, break pieces off, and carry on from there. So as you can see, I've got a few different pieces of broken bit here that I'm going to look to add in. This bit's just going to hopefully just sort of slot in if we get it positioned in the right way. And I'm just going to use a scalpel to trim a few little bits off the edge just to make it fit and have a slightly more sort of straight edge on that edge that sits against the other tile pieces. So just finish chopping off a few of these little bits here. And then as we look, yeah, that fits a little bit more neatly. And of course, that edge against the rounded edge of the base is not really going to make too much of a difference because we're going to look to trim some of that down. But I'll get this piece in here and then we'll go from there. So what I'm going to do here is just sort of speed things up a little bit and start to show what we want to do for the rest of this base. So as you can see, we've got the format laid out, and the previous versions there we've got with some damage applied. What we're going to try and do is recreate that for this base. As you can see, I've rounded the edges off and I've applied the damage across some of the tiles in different places. Now we can work that in different ways. The first bit I'm going to do is just use a scalpel to sort of trim and tidy a few bits up, and add some scarring, use the back end of the scalpel blade to do a few bits of damage. But I'm just going to come back and I'm just going to take these edges off and score across the back of them, and just sort of use another tool to snap those edges away, a little bit like you might do with sort of bits of glass. And as you can see there, that piece has actually come off, and you can see that with this resin sometimes there's a skin or a layer and it comes off, so it adheres to that as opposed to the whole tile itself. It's not particularly porous in that sense, but that actually helps us in this sense because we can glue that back on, and there's some pre-made damage that you can see we've now already got on this tile, so not a problem. Continue with trimming the rest of the little bits off here, and you'll probably end up with a bit more damage on a few of the other bits. As you can see, there's another piece there, so we'll get that put back on, and don't quite put it on perfectly, create that slight gap, and again it just creates that impression of a more naturally damaged sort of piece of tile or brick, whatever, kind of whatever you're looking for. And actually, using some of the bits that I've trimmed off here, I can add those to the some of the slight gaps around the edge of the base, just to again fill out that a little bit more completely. And as you can see here, we've now got a few straight sort of square edges. So what I'm going to do is just try and use the scalpel to round those off slightly, again creating a little bit more of that damage. And actually in this particular instance, like I said, this actually really helps the effect that we're trying to achieve. And as you can see, this stage is quite messy. The resin that I'm using here, because it's quite porous, it's not porous, sorry, but it's quite brittle. It's a powder-based resin, so you are going to get a lot of white powder all over the place, a few sort of crumbs and bits here and there. So you're probably just going to want to make sure that you're doing this in a place that you don't mind getting dirty. I don't recommend doing it on your dining room table, for example. So as you've just seen there, I've used the back end of the handle on the scalpel to apply pressure to some of these slabs to create that break-in. We don't need to use too much in terms of sort of sharp knives, tools, or anything like that. In a lot of cases, actually, we can just use that flat edge to apply pressure, and these will break themselves. And then what I'm going to do is go in with the scalpel, as you can see here, to create some of that scarring and that sort of smaller chipping effect in terms of how an impact to a marble tile or something like that might create damage and weathering appropriately. So as you can see, I've just sort of scored along a few of those areas, create a few more scars, chip away, scratch away. You can really do this however you want. You could use a Brillo pad if you wanted to sort of rough that surface up. You can do whatever you want. And there we go. We now have this sort of weathered looking base. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take this base and we're going to apply a few more textures to it. In particular, I'm using this desert sand textured paint. Of course, we're not adding sand, but what this does is it gives us quite a fine texture of sort of textured earth. And if we apply this to some of the cracks, it might look, like sort of build-ups of dirt, some of the build-up of, kind of broken pieces of this. And we're just going to apply it in a few spots around the base. And of course, paint it up as usual, in keeping with the rest of the base itself, rather than paint it like sand. There are a few different types you can use. In particular, I'm using Vallejo on this one, but there are others, sort of Ammo, MIG, AK Interactive, all those sorts. This is just the one I have at hand, and this one I'm using. So as you can see here, I've got a little bit on the brush, and I'm just going to apply it to a few different areas. Some of the cracks, some of the crevices, just at the joins. Really, you just apply this however you really want to. I'm not putting a lot on this, and I'm not putting it across the whole base. I want to keep some of the character of the bits that we're seeing, that we've created the damage for and such, and just sort of use a little bit of water to spread it out and make it look a little bit more natural in that sense. And that's pretty much that for that phase, really. I'm just going to sort of tidy a few of these little bits up, but it's just a little bit of this texture just to add to the overall feel of the base itself. And there we go. that's pretty much it. So we're just going to wait for that to dry. This texture paint can take a little bit of time to dry properly, so just make sure you allow for that. Otherwise, when you come to paint or apply other effects, it can sometimes smush around and kind of mess with the overall effect, but that might be what you're going for. And then once that's dry, we're going to take it and abracadabra, it's primed and ready to go. I primed this off screen because the weather was rubbish and I didn't have the patience or the time to show that process, but it's just a regular primer. So now the primer is dry, we're going to start the process of building the paint layers up using the airbrush. As you can see, the grey primer has sort of highlighted a few of the areas to do with the damage and some of the sort of texture we put on there, and that'll give us a really good base to build up from. But I'm going to paint this like marble, so what we're going to do is we're going to build this up from black, as you can see here. I'm going to just sort of blast through this quite quickly. The marble method I'm going to be using is one that was taught to me by Miles of Little Legend Studio, and a few of you might be familiar with this method. There are a few different ways of approaching marble, but we're going to be using the wet wipe method. I will go through that, sort of how to do it, some of the best approaches that I find. That doesn't mean it's the sort of be all end all of how to approach this process, but just how I approach it personally based on what I've been taught. So we're going to build up the base with black and then a sort of a grey highlight. I'm just going to give this a little bit of time to dry a little bit more before applying another layer. This is Tamiya flat black and it gives a nice sort of smooth matte black finish, and of course that's what we want. We're making marble. You might go for different colours in terms of, kind of if you want to show blue marble, green marble, whatever. There might be an element of wanting to show, kind of a gloss texture with some of the material coming through on the marble, but that can all be achieved through sort of different methodologies in terms of if you want to, apply a gloss before you do the marble, etc., just to keep that sort of sheen. But we're just going to go for the matte approach here. So this is flat black, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a grey colour. I believe this is German grey. I'm just going to highlight in a few of the corners and some of the areas of the tiles, just to try and show that difference in colour rather than going straight in black and then just white. Of course, for the most part, this probably won't even be noticed too much, but it's a force of habit and it's something I like to keep to. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the actual process of creating the marble. So I'm going to get a wet wipe and I'm going to sort of zoom out and show you how I would prepare that wet wipe for use in this process, which is an overlay spray through kind of method. So I'll get that set up and then we'll go through that. So what I've got here is a wet wipe, and it's important to remember that this really should be, or has to be, completely bone dry to use this. If this is damp or wet still in any way, this technique is probably not going to work very well, if at all. So it's just worthwhile remembering this needs to be completely dried before we start pulling it apart. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that larger wet wipe and I'm going to cut a smaller piece off it, as you can see here, because what we need is enough to cover the item and enough to have spare to grab, as I'll kind of show you, but we don't need the whole thing, it'll just get in the way. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to tease apart some of the fibres in fairly random patterns. Just pull it apart as you want to go. Be careful not to pull it too hard, you don't just want to rip a great big hole in the middle, but you can already see how the fibres are coming apart. There is kind of how that marble pattern is going to manifest when we put it over the piece and spray the paint through it. Now, because this is quite a small base, I'm going to leave some of the holes quite small. I don't want to just overdo it and then make it so that there's like a little bit of marble pattern in the corner. I want to make sure that there's some big areas, some small areas, and then, as you can see, I'm going to wrap it over the base, twist it behind, and I'm going to use that as how I hold on to this piece while I spray through with the airbrush. You can see there's some nice open areas, there's a couple more closed up areas there, so it should start to create quite a nice pattern in terms of how we want to change from a flat black surface into a black, white and grey marble surface. And of course, like I mentioned before, one of the things that's important to remember is not having to leave this on while the paint dries, you can take it off almost straight away. In fact, I prefer doing it that way, because otherwise sometimes the fibres from the wet wipe can actually dry into the surface. You've got to go over, you've got to pick them all out, and it just becomes a bit of an admin nightmare if you have a lot to do. And in this case, I have about 50 of these to do. So what I'll do is I'll take it off, and if you realise that you aren't the biggest fan of the pattern as it is, you can replace the wet wipe, do it in a slightly different area. You can even just go over it with a light layer of white or whatever top colour is that you want to do, to try and just sort of either tone down or change the pattern to whatever appetite you have for the base that you're trying to do. Kind of uneven surfaces such as vehicles, models, those sorts of things. It does become a little bit harder, and you need to be a little bit better at holding the surface flat, but it's possible. So I'm just going to go over this with quite a thick mixture of this sort of bone colour. And I say thick because I find if you thin the paint too much, like you would normally do for a base layer or whatever it is, sometimes it can bleed under the fibres of the wet wipe, and it can kind of destroy some of that definition of how you're trying to create that marble effect. So I tend to mix this a little bit thicker. It dries a little bit slower in that sense, but because it's quite thick and it's quite a small surface area, if you do kind of thin layers, it's negligible really. So just sort of build that up to the level that you want. You're trying to just sort of create that base, because as with the black and the grey undercoat, with this I'm doing this sort of bone cream colour, and then I'm going to highlight that in a couple of places with a pure white, to kind of again show that tone difference between the various layers of the marble. And one thing to remember here is that, as with some parts of this base, as you can see, some of the fibres are still quite tight together. If you try to do this in one or two thin layers, the paint may not penetrate the fibres of the wet wipe that well. So it's best to just make sure and check on this throughout to make sure you are getting that coverage that you're after, because what you don't want to do is find, once you take this off, that you're actually happy with the pattern placement but not particularly happy with how the pattern has actually come through overall. So as you can see now, I've come back to the pure white layer. This is the one, because this is mixed quite thin, if we're not careful, this will go on and kind of immediately be shadowed out by the underlayer. So we need to just make sure we're really happy with the white. You, of course, if the one I'm going for is more of a grey, black, white marble approach. In some instances, that transition with the white, the cream, the black, the grey, etc., might be more, kind of a sliding scale. But we're just going to check this now. We're going to take this off, as I mentioned, to give it a little look at how we're finding this first run. And as you can see, it's already sticking. So we just need to be careful with how we peel that off. And there we go. Straight away, I'm actually really pleased with that patterning. I think that's come out really well. I'll just pick off a few of the loose fibres there. And I'm quite happy with, the sort of the patches, the lines, how that is generally working out to this point. You can, of course, like I say, place the wet wipe back over, or dry wipe by this point again. Like I guess, probably best in this instance to not use the exact same spot, because some of those fibres will be a bit clogged up with the paint and might not sort of give you as good of a second result. So I'm just going to pull apart some of the other pieces and put them over in a slightly different pattern, and just give it a really quick sort of spray over without having to pick it up, without anything else. It's just going to be a really quick spray, a little bit more white over the top to try and clear up and thin out some of those darker areas in a couple of random spots. So just give it a little bit more of a hit with the white there, take that off again. And as you can see, that's just softened up some of those black areas and has put a couple more, sort of slightly paler white patches in to again show that sort of slight transition. And here we have a smooth transition to the base on a painting handle, or what is or was a whiskey cork. As you can see, the slight gloss to this. Off camera, I've gloss varnished this to prepare for the next layer of oils. I don't really think this step needs covering in every single video that I do. It's a fairly obvious step by this point, I think, in terms of what we need to do to prepare the surface, but I'm going to use this brown or burnt umber oil to display some of the areas of dirt that I mentioned earlier in the video. So I've prepped the base with varnish, because I think if you put the oil and the white spirit straight onto, you know, kind of water-based or alcohol-based acrylic paints, it can cause a few issues, and it can just make the paint bleed and kind of undo all the hard work that we've done to this point. So I'm going to use this fairly fine tip Games Workshop brush. Doesn't need to be an expensive brush for this, but I am wanting a little bit of precision with how I've done this, and I've mixed the oil into kind of slightly thicker than a wash. But if you've worked with oils before, you kind of know how they can work. So we can use pin washers and that sort of stuff, and some of this might work like a pin wash might. You know, it might just sort of, as you can see, flow quite easily into those cracks between the stone pieces. But it's really important to remember, with oils at this stage, you really don't need to be that precise, because a big part of what we're going to do is move some of that paint around. We're going to dilute it down, thin it out, draw it out across the base, but most of this is just to add that slight extra level of depth in terms of, you know, kind of accumulation of dirt and filth that you might see in an old kind of worn down stone or marble pathway that we're trying to show here. This is a step that realistically you can completely avoid if you want to. This is mostly just because I wanted to do this for myself more than anything. I think it adds that extra bit of like I say, colour and depth and a bit of interest. Now that we've done all of these processes up to this point to pretty much keep it monochrome, this just helps to bring it into that sort of slight element of realism, of adding in a little bit of real world colour. So as you can see, I'm not being particularly neat or tidy with this, and that's because we can just, you know, rub or brush or dab, wipe, whatever, some of this away to leave behind those sort of deposits of the bits that we want to see, which I will of course move on to. So we're coming up on the end of applying the stuff here, and I know a lot of people say, you know, wipe, don't dab, dab, don't wipe, brush, don't wipe, whatever. For this, because of the rough patches, the first stage I'm going to do, I'm actually going to dab the majority of these bits away, just to leave back the little bits that have gone into the crevice, and then I'm going to rebuild another little bit of oil. And again, really that's just a point of personal preference. I'm doing it to build layers up, rather than that kind of one size fits all sort of thing. So as you can see, just sort of dabbing and wiping quite gently. Don't be too rough with it. Some parts I'm being a little bit rough, you can see, but as you can already see there's that tint now. So we've got that brown tint on some of the slabs, which I will actually sort of work back so it's not across the whole base, but you can see how that brown is starting to sink into those recesses, just to sort of show that hint of dirt and mud deposits over time that would just naturally occur with this sort of surface. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the brush and I'm just going to try and tidy this up with a little bit more precision. Again, just applying white spirit to tidy up some of these sort of bits that almost look tea stained or like an old worn map or something like that. And just try to tidy them up so it neatens up where that deposit of dirt and dust and filth might be. And actually, for a lot of surfaces that you want to use the oil on, like Zone Mortalis or Necromunda board or something like that, actually this kind of wholesale deposit of filth across the whole surface might actually be exactly what you're going for. You know, if you recall back to the Zone Mortalis industrial base that I did with the stripes, part of the whole point of that was to show an overwhelming layer of filth across the whole surface, whereas this is trying to be a little bit more precise whilst allowing a few areas to just sort of show that built up element of dirt. And then what I'm going to do here is just go and try to pick out the sort of the gouges or the cracks, the surface cracks in some of these tiles. The idea is not the deep ones that we've already covered, but the ones that have just been, they've been scuffed or they've been caught with traffic or people dragging weapons, strikes, those kinds of things, and just try to sort of pick those out so you can actually see them a little bit better in terms of at a first glance of this model. Some of the scratches might not necessarily appear immediately if you sort of degrade that too much straight away. So now you can see that the oil's dried. You can leave this to be done naturally, or you can use a hairdryer, of course, to speed things up. But you can see it's dried with that lovely kind of matte, dirty mud kind of appearance. So what we're going to do now at this point is start to build up the final layers of how we want to weather and add a bit of character to this base. And in this particular example, what I'm going to do is use a kind of leaf litter imitation type material. You can get this from a few different providers, but I believe the one I'm using on this occasion is actually from Green Stuff World. Like I say, you can get them from all over, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a thinned down layer of PVA glue to secure the leaves to the base. I'm just going to apply that in quite liberal blobs, just into not all over the base as you imagine, but just in a few places to show where the leaves are kind of blowing around, they're collecting, where that sort of leaf litter is going to sort of build up or pass through this particular area. And then I'm just going to grab clumps of the leaf litter and I'm going to drop it all over the places where that glue is situated. And you don't have to be too neat with this. A little bit like applying kind of sand to your bases. You probably want to apply, or in some cases you probably want to cover the surface of whatever it is you're trying to apply stuff to, under the idea that in real terms most of that will shake off once it's dry. So as you can see, I've given it a first shake off to sort of see where the leaves are starting to stick. You can see some patches there where nothing has stuck, so I'm just going to dump a load more leaves onto this to try and fill those gaps of where I've kind of placed or dolloped the PVA glue. And like I say, you don't need to be too precise. You could in theory just dunk the base in the pot of leaves, but I think sometimes when you do that you can actually end up with the mass of leaves pulling off the bits that haven't dried yet, and then you end up with leaves all stuck together with PVA glue in the pot. So I'm just applying them to the surface like this in a rather large clump, and then we're just going to give the PVA glue a little bit of time to dry, not using a hairdryer of course. And once that has dried, it'll look pretty much as you did before, but importantly we just need to shake off or brush off some of the excess to make sure that the bits that we want to stick have stuck, and the bits that haven't, or we don't want to stick, haven't. So I've just shaken that off a little bit lightly there. What I am going to do actually is use a brush, because I don't want this many leaves on this. I just want a few. I don't want to overcrowd that marble too much. I just want to sort of pick out a few areas. So using a really soft brush and really light motions, just in case anything hasn't properly stuck, I'm going to remove the loose bits like that, clear up a bit of space from what I want and don't want, and I'm left with this. Get the camera to focus, you can see, there we go. So that's picking out some of the areas with leaf litter, some of that textured paint that we mentioned before, and even if you can't actually see that textured paint now, a lot of what the textured paint and the PVA is going to do is provide a decent surface for the leaves to adhere to. And then from this point, what I'm going to do is apply an incredibly thin down layer of PVA, like very much like a wash, or how you might sort of seal a plaster job or whatever, just to sort of seal these in place and give them that little bit of extra protection. Of course, once we start taking this base out into the world at tournaments, events, games, whatever, we just we want to provide as much protection for that as possible. So a really thin down layer of PVA here, just to seal those leaves in place and give them that little bit of extra protection. You can of course skip this step, because I think if you apply a varnish layer on top of this and you're quite sort of gentle with that, that will also do the same sort of thing. It will provide that top coat, that clear coat, to protect the whole piece. But I'm just going to put a really, really super thin down layer of PVA on this, just to ensure that extra protective layer. So now all that PVA should be nice and dried, and giving us that extra protection of having sealed those leaves in place. So now what I want to do for the final bit really is to take a tuft of grass and add it into the mix, just to sort of show where some of those slabs have cracked. Life has started to come through. I'm going to use one of these darker tufts. As you can see, that sort of sandy, kind of dead grass feel. I'm not using a whole one of these dots. What I am going to do is just sort of cut a piece out of one and put that into the mix where we want. And I'm going to apply that into one of the cracked parts of the tile, again, just to show that where that impact has occurred, something has got in and grass has started to grow. So I've taken this off the sheet, this larger tuft, and as I say, I'm just going to cut out a really small piece. This is up user's preference if you want to follow this tutorial exactly. My recommendation would be to, even if you want to add more grass to the base, you can just add a few more smaller pieces in some of the other cracks rather than adding a whole thing. Otherwise, you've wasted a large amount of time on the amount of detail we've done up to this point. So what I'm going to do is, you can probably see kind of top left here, there's that wide crack, just the top side of that leaf there. That's where I'm going to put, that's where I'm going to put this small tuft of grass, and I'm just sort of putting that out with the tweezers here. And I'm going to use the tweezers to get that in place, and then use one of my sculpting tools, just sort of to make sure that that is in place properly. So I'm going to place that there. These have got like kind of sticky dots on the back of them, so you can use extra glue to secure them if you really want. I find that they're completely fine. They're designed to stick to these sorts of surfaces in this sort of way. So I'm just going to push that in with the tip of this sculpting tool, make sure that's all nice and secure, and then I'm going to try and sort of position it in the best way I can. And as you can see from this shot, I've spent most of that process slightly off camera, but you can see here that how that's been applied and how that's been sort of pushed in. It's not very technical. It's cut a piece off, put it in a small gap, push it in the small gap to make sure it's secure and stuck, and then that's that in terms of the process for this. I'm just gonna go around the rim of this base with some black paint to make sure it looks presentable, and then that is pretty much this entire process done. So here we are for that final step. As I mentioned, I'm just going to tidy this up. I'm a big fan of black rimming the bases to make sure they're all neat and tidy. Nothing fancy or technical here. This is just thinned down Games Workshop or Citadel Abaddon black paint, applied reasonably thickly, but not so thick that we're going to get brush strokes at the end. Just going to go around this until it's all nice, neat and tidy, being careful enough not to get any on the base or the modelled part of the base that we've done. In terms of this tutorial, of course, I've used a couple of what I might describe as kind of intermediate or slightly more skilled techniques in terms of use of the airbrush, the marble technique, some of the oil process, which I know can be fairly intimidating when you first do it. I know it was for myself. Use of some of the leaf litter and the other sort of gaming scenic parts. But of course there are other options, there are other ways of doing this. You can stipple effect the marble, you can sponge weather the marble and some of the damage in that sense. And if that sort of basing approach is something that people would like to see us do in the future, instead of just this heavy focus on the airbrush, then of course just drop a comment in the thread. Let us know what you'd like to see and how you'd like to see something achieved, and we can look to see how we might be able to accommodate that for the studio tutorials going forward. Here we are with the complete base, the black's dried, the base is all nice and neat and tidy. The only thing I will probably go over and do at this point is give it a final varnish layer to make sure all is good, but that's that for this tutorial. That is a Minas Tirith or Osgiliath themed weathered marble base tutorial, from the build point to the final point of painting, weathering and applying again some of those scenics. If this is something you liked, let us know, like, subscribe if you haven't already, leave some comments, but other than that I will see you next time, and thank you very much for just stopping by.